Good morning. So I have to tell you, it is good to be here this morning after a long and crazy week where I feel like we have been kind of all over the place, but it's good to finally see everybody here. Tonight, remember last week with our church history study, we started talking about the English separatists, and this week we're going to go into one of the lives of one of those men who helped begin what we know today as the Baptist Church, and that is John Smith. Now, before I say the name John Smith, because I've gotten this question twice now, are we talking about the same John Smith that went over and talked to Pocahontas? No. Different John Smith. Okay? So, we're going to talk tonight about really starting up with where the Baptist Church, where we came from, and what that started looking like during the time of the English Reformation. So join us tonight at 6 o'clock, and we'll start talking about John Smith, and then we'll go into a little bit more in the coming weeks of other men that helped spurn the start of what we know today as the Baptist Church. I'm about to annoy my wife a little bit. Just forewarning a little bit, because my wife and me have very different movie tastes. Very different movie tastes. One of my favorites is Star Wars. Love Star Wars. The first trilogy of Star Wars, the actual first trilogy of Star Wars, okay? Let's get that straight. Love Star Wars. Wife likes chick flicks. I love Star Wars. One of my favorite parts of Star Wars is actually at the very beginning of the actual first movie, where Princess Leia, she is trapped in her ship, and she needs to send out a message with plans for this giant weapon that the evil empire is making, and she is trying to send the plans out to this man, this Jedi Master, who she knows can help him. And so she puts the plans in this droid, and she sends a message with this droid, hoping that this droid with this message and these plans will get to this Jedi Master who she knows he can help them. And she says this line right here, "Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi. You are my only hope." How fitting today as we take a look at this story right here, starting in Luke chapter 7. And we start in verse 1 today. When he had concluded all his sayings in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. A centurion's slave who was highly valued by him was sick and about to die. When the centurion heard about Jesus, he sent some Jewish elders to him, requesting him to come and save the life of his slave. When they reached Jesus, they pleaded with him earnestly, saying, "He is worthy for you to grant this, because he loves our nation and has built us a synagogue." Jesus went with them, and when he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends to tell him, "Lord, don't trouble yourself, since I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. This is why I didn't even consider myself worthy to come to you. But say the word, and my servant will be cured. For I too am a man placed under authority, having soldiers under my command. I say to this one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my slave, do this, and he does it." Jesus heard this and was amazed at him. And turning to the crowd following him, he said, "I tell you, I have not found so great a faith even in Israel." When those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the slave in good health. We begin today going back through a little bit of what has happened thus far. Jesus had just finished his sermon to his disciples. We remember that this sermon that Jesus had given, the crowd was there, and they were listening intently to what Jesus was saying, but Jesus, during this sermon, was primarily training his disciples to be like him and live in a way that's pleasing to him. This sermon was at its core, in its basic concept, was what faith and the life of a faithful disciple of Christ should look like. And the start of that process in that life, in that faith, is to trust in Him. That's faith. And it's the beginning of living this life pleasing to God. True faith begins with realizing the need for Jesus. That's why Jesus starts off with this sermon at the very beginning saying, "Blessed are those who are poor." And in other places we see poor in spirit. Those who recognize that they have nothing to offer before God in terms of redeeming the relationship between God and man, and that they need God's intervention. That's actually through Christ. With that internal need comes the seeking of good treasure. We talked a couple weeks ago about good trees, which have good treasure inside of them, producing good fruit. And the good treasure is those things that are of God, the things of Jesus, the things that He is teaching to live a life pleasing to Him. By placing faith in Jesus, you put Jesus back on the place internally that He belongs on the throne of the heart, and put what He says in your heart and in your mind. But then from that internal trust, we talked last week about Jesus saying to His disciples, "Why do you call me Lord and don't do what I say?" From that internal trust comes action. It's ridiculous to say you need Jesus and want to trust Him, but not actually follow through and do what He says. With true faith comes an external response. So we see that faith has an internal and an external to it. An internal trust in not just Jesus, but the things that Jesus teaches, and then an external, do something about it. If we truly call Jesus Lord, then from that we will do what He says. So Jesus finishes this sermon and then moves into the town of Capernaum, where we've seen other stories that Luke has given account to before. This is a fishing city. Peter, James, and John, along with some of the other apostles, came from this city. A good number from this crowd came from this city. This is actually one of the centers of Jesus' ministry on the northern edge of the Sea of Galilee. But there's a centurion over this town of Capernaum. And we ask what a centurion is. A centurion would be an equivalent to what is actually a sergeant major in today's army. The man was over a regiment of probably about 100 soldiers within this city. And we can also assume that this centurion is also a Gentile. He's not Jewish. Maybe not Roman, but because there was a lot of times where other people from other nations were used in Roman armies and could advance in the Roman army to the position of a centurion. But the bottom line is, he's not Jewish. He was a Gentile, high-ranked centurion in the Roman army, someone who has control and authority in Capernaum. He was someone who was expected to maintain law and order in Capernaum, but someone who was still a Gentile and part of the Roman army. Now, this centurion had a servant. Now, when we think of a servant, or in these days especially, or a slave, a lot of times slaves and servants in this culture were not treated well. They were treated pretty horribly. Some likened them to cattle. But this centurion, this specific centurion, saw his servant as someone a lot different than most. The centurion actually cares about his servant. And from the language that's used in this passage right here, some scholars have said that this centurion might have actually looked at this servant like a son, like part of his own family. So instead of someone who's treated like dirt, like an animal, instead we see this centurion actually looked at this servant like family. The centurion cared about this servant in a familial way. But this servant was sick. The servant was sick to the point that this servant was dying. The centurion and his household are at the point that they think, there's nothing left. Our friend is going to die. Our family member is going to die. They've reached the end, and they don't think they have any other options. And they're desperate. And the centurion, greatly distraught from the plight of his servant, because this servant is someone he cares about, is about to die, and he's desperate. He needs something. He needs someone to help his servant because he doesn't have any ideas. Then enter Jesus. Jesus, again, had just finished speaking to his apostles and the crowd about how to live a life pleasing before God, how to have faith, true faith. But before that, Jesus had been doing something very interesting. You see, here he's been doing something that we've seen him do before. Think back a little bit to the episode we saw in Nazareth, where Jesus spoke of this prophecy in Isaiah, and then he told the people in Nazareth, "Today you have seen this prophecy fulfilled." And he basically made the claim that I am the Messiah. I am who fulfills this prophecy in Isaiah. And then he went on to talk about the unbelief of the Jewish people and the people in Nazareth, which put them in a rage, and they chased him out of town. But the prophecy that Jesus referred to in that passage said that the Messiah would do three things. And one of these three things should come to our mind right here. And that is that the Messiah, this person in Isaiah, would heal the sick. And that's exactly what Jesus has been doing, along with the other two acts that Isaiah says the Messiah is going to do. Time and time again, Jesus fulfills this prophecy, showing who he is. Time and time again, sick people, people even with terminal diseases, with leprosy, who thought they had no hope in ever getting well. And Jesus heals them in full view of the crowd, who then go out and spread the word. And someone in that crowd went and found that centurion. Someone who saw what Jesus was doing went out and found that centurion. We don't know exactly who told the centurion, but we do know that news spread. News spread about Jesus to the entire countryside. That's even reached places like Jerusalem, Tyre, Sidon. It was going all across Judea. People knew about Jesus and knew what he was doing. And they knew he's in Capernaum, which is exactly where the centurion is. Now let's be clear. We don't have any indication that this centurion completely understands who Jesus is, completely understands what Jesus is really claiming. We know from even later on in Scripture, the apostles still don't completely get who Jesus is. We've described it before. I love Peter, but there are multiple times while Jesus is standing right in front of him that Peter does some pretty stupid things. And you kind of want to bang your head against the wall because Jesus has proven himself time and time again to Peter and couldn't be more blatantly obvious. But Peter just sits there and still does something dumb. And he's right there with Jesus seeing these things happen the entire time, and it takes him forever to finally get it. So we can assume from this, they don't completely understand who they're dealing with. The centurion most likely probably doesn't fully understand who Jesus is, that Jesus is God. And that's why Jesus has the ability and the authority to do what he can. But what we do know is that the centurion heard about Jesus and that he saw Jesus as his only hope left to heal his servant. The centurion has a need, and he hears about Jesus, and he knows that Jesus is exactly who he needs. He needs Jesus, and he has trust that Jesus can do what he's been doing. So he knows that Jesus not only has the ability, because he had heard that Jesus had been healing people, but he knows that Jesus has the authority to heal as well. This authority from God. Centurion might not know exactly who Jesus is, but we see from how he treats Jesus later that he knows and believes that Jesus is deserving of some kind of higher honor. He knows that Jesus is the one he needs. He knows that Jesus has the ability. He knows that Jesus can heal his servant. He knows that Jesus has the authority, that Jesus has a different kind of authority, and that that authority can make the impossible possible. But the centurion doesn't go himself to speak to Jesus, at least from what we can see here in this text. He might not have gone himself at first, because the account in Matthew might actually indicate differently that he might have eventually did go out to Jesus. We see in Matthew 8. But he doesn't at first. Instead, who does he send? He sends some people who are very interesting, especially with what we know about this centurion right here. He doesn't send his servants, nor anyone from his household. He sends the Jewish elders of the town to plead for Jesus' help. Two questions should enter our minds right there. Two questions should come up. A centurion is a man of great authority in the town, and he needed something from Jesus. So why didn't he just go and ask Jesus, or since he's a centurion, why didn't he just go and tell Jesus, go heal my servant? If he's got all of this authority, if he is the Roman centurion, why didn't he just go up and tell Jesus, go heal my servant? Instead, he sends Jewish elders to go and plead for him. So let's think about this picture for a second. A Gentile centurion sent Jewish elders to plead for Jesus' help. Second question. Why did the elders even listen to him? Because at this point, we've talked about it here before, the Gentiles and the Jewish people are not on good terms. The Gentiles and the Jewish people do not like each other at all. Specifically, the Jewish people do not like the Roman military. And the Roman military, they don't like the Jewish people. They both see each other as a blight, as a blemish on this planet. So why did these elders listen to a Roman centurion and go and plead on his behalf? Why were they willingly going to plead on behalf of this, what other Jewish people would regard him as an invader, for Jesus' help? But we see the elders listen. And these elders go to Jesus and did what the centurion asked. They plead for this servant because they care about the centurion and they care about his servant. Why would the elders have such a concern for this Gentile centurion? Why would they even consider going up and asking for Jesus to help? Here we get to know a little bit about the character of this specific centurion, because he is unlike any Roman officer we have seen thus far. These elders tell Jesus that he is worthy of this favor, of this blessing that Jesus is going to heal his servant. Why? First, they say he loves Israel and the Jewish people. That's got to blow our minds for a second. Because we know what the Gentile Roman army thinks about the Jewish people. We know what the Jewish people think about the Gentile Roman army. And yet, these people, these Jewish elders are saying this Gentile centurion loves us. What? The Roman military, the people who have taken over the land, see the Jewish people as an offense because the Jewish teachers believe the Gentiles are nothing but scum and that they're not able to be saved. So neither side likes each other except this one Gentile centurion. He loves Israel and he loves the Jewish people. And he knows about the Jewish people. He knows about their customs. He knows about their traditions. So we have a centurion who not only cares about his servants to the point that he's distraught when one of them is about to die, but he also loves the people around him who are under his authority and his protection. And what's more is he shows it. Because the elders say, look, we know he loves Israel and the Jewish people. And we know it. Why? Because he built us our synagogue. He built us this synagogue as a sign of his love and his blessing upon the Jewish people. He built them a place to worship their God. And Jesus hears their pleas and sees the character of this centurion and what he's done for God's chosen people. The Old Testament speaks of those who bless God's chosen people being blessed. And this centurion is a perfect example of a Gentile who loves and cares for God's chosen people. And because of that, the Jewish elders, the Jewish people, they love and they care for the centurion and his servant. They vouch for him. And so they go and they plead for Jesus to go and help. And Jesus sees this and he has compassion for them. So he goes to see the centurion and his servant. And Jesus starts coming close to this house. But the centurion rushes his friends out to go and stop Jesus from coming into the town, into the house. Why? Why would the centurion stop Jesus, who is going to heal his servant? And this actually goes hand in hand with, remember, our first question. Why didn't the centurion go to Jesus himself? Because according to the Jewish customs and Jewish traditions, a Jewish holy man or rabbi, someone like Jesus, someone like how the Jewish people considered Jesus around Capernaum, someone of his stature could not enter an unclean house, or in other words, a Gentile house. Now we know that Jesus has gone out and dined with sinners, and we can guess that he would not have had a problem going into this house because he was on his way into this house. But we see something interesting here. The centurion recognizes the traditions of the Jewish people and saw his place. He recognizes at least some of who Jesus is right here by saying that he himself is not even worthy to have Jesus even come into his home. This is the same man who the Jewish elders vouched for and said, he's worthy of this blessing. But the centurion is so humble that he says, I'm not worthy to even have you in my house. This Roman centurion does not even believe that he is worthy to have Jesus in his home. And we see how much of a high regard that this centurion has for Jesus, because he does not even believe that he's even worthy to meet Jesus. He didn't go out and say, Jesus, please come and help, because he did not believe it was his place. He's not worthy, and he recognizes his place before the Messiah, that he might be a centurion, but this Jesus is someone different, and he deserves this kind of respect and honor. And he is not presumptuous enough to expect that Jesus should even give him this honor, much less come into his home. Now, Matthew writes in chapter 8 that the centurion actually spoke to Jesus. We need to comment on this for a second, because whether this is Matthew just writing that the centurion spoke through his friends by proxy, or that the centurion eventually just came out himself and actually spoke to Jesus himself, and Luke doesn't actually record that part, that's up for debate. Regardless, though, the result and the attitude of the centurion is still the same. This centurion sees Jesus and does not believe he is worthy to even have Jesus come into his house because of who Jesus is and what he can do, because of Jesus' ability and his authority. The centurion thought it was audacious of himself to even ask. He doesn't demand anything from Jesus, but he asks Jesus to just say the word. The centurion knows his place before Jesus, and he knows that Jesus is someone different, and that's the only thing that makes sense. So he knows he is in no position to demand anything from Jesus. And he shows his humility. We have a Roman centurion who is humble. We need to understand how amazing that picture is for a second. That a Roman centurion who has been in battle, who has commanded men in battle, and has been victorious, is humble before Jesus. The centurion says that he knows that if Jesus just says the word, he knows it'll happen. No question. No question on his mind. He knows if Jesus says it, it's done. And the centurion believes that Jesus doesn't even need to come into his house. He knows and trusts that if Jesus just even said the word, his servant's going to get better. The centurion knows he needs Jesus, and he trusts in Jesus' ability and authority. And so he asks. He has complete trust in Jesus' ability and authority to be able to heal his servant with just a word. And he relates it to his own authority, saying that if he says to a servant or a slave to go and do this or come and do that, he knows it'll get done. No question. If you want something to get it done, it will be done. He just needs to say the word. In the same way, he knows Jesus has that ability and authority over everything. It's the only thing that makes sense on why Jesus would be able to do all of these miraculous things. So he has complete faith that Jesus can say the word and his servant's going to get better. He does not show a shred of doubt. He has a need for Jesus. He believes that Jesus can heal, and so he doesn't even question Jesus. He just says, I know you can say the word and it'll be done. He shows that faith with the action of telling Jesus about it and just asking. And Jesus marvels at the faith of this centurion because this is something amazing right here. This is something different, and Jesus sees it. We can only just imagine for a second the smile that's got to come across Jesus' face as he sees someone who he has compassion for recognize Jesus and trust him fully for his ability and authority. Because at this point, Jesus has not seen that yet. Jesus looks at this centurion and basically says, this is what I've been talking about. This right here is the faith that should be aspired to. This is what he just preached on. This is faith right here. But we also see in the other account in Matthew 8 that Jesus also says something to the crowds as well. He says this in Matthew chapter 8, verse 10. Hearing this, Jesus was amazed and said to those following him, I assure you, I have not found anyone in Israel with so great a faith. I will tell you that many will come from the east and the west and recline at the table with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the sons of the kingdom will be thrown out into the darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. It's referring to the crowd that surrounds him. It says here to the Jewish people who hold to this false life raft of being descendants of Abraham as their ticket for salvation, not knowing or not wanting to know that that's not what's going to save them. That can't save them. It's faith in Jesus that's going to save them. Faith like this centurion right here who knows Jesus is his only hope, who believes in what Jesus has said and done, and who acts on it by seeking him out and asking him to heal without any presumption or question. It's faith that Jesus has not seen yet. And Jesus has got to be looking back at all the times he's been rejected by his own people who think they are the pinnacle of faith, who think they are at the pinnacle of salvation, and this relationship between God and the Jewish people is put on the pedestal, not knowing that they have God right in front of them, and they reject him. We got to think about how insane this is, that the Jewish people claim, especially the Jewish leaders and Pharisees, who at this point hate Jesus, claim they have this relationship with God based on their descendants from Abraham. But when God steps right in front of them, they don't recognize him. And he stands there and holds a Gentile as the example of faith. Because when it comes down to it in terms of the relationship between God and man, ancestry can't save you. The law was only good enough to condemn and point the way to a need for God's intervention. And all that matters is, do they trust in the intervention of God incarnate, Jesus as their only hope? Do we have the same kind of faith in Jesus that this Gentile had? At the end of the story, we see this, that the servant was made well. The friends went home, the centurion went home, and his servant was well again. What we should learn today is this: the faith that is to be aspired to is one that humbly trusts Jesus without question or presumption. Jesus as God incarnate, who came down and died for the sins of humanity and rose again, is the only hope humanity has for redemption between God and man. That's it. Right now, without Jesus, we would stand in judgment against God. Without Jesus, there wouldn't be any hope. There isn't any hope. But Jesus came, Jesus died, and Jesus rose. That's reality. And because of that, we do have hope. But it's only through Him that we can have that. Every other faith in the world offers this false hope simply for the fact that at the end of the day, their methods come down to this: you being the one to do things to get back into that right relationship with deity. Do good works, do certain things, and you can have paradise. But Christianity is the only one that has God incarnate as its founder, who tells us you can't do it on your own. No amount of works, no amount of deeds will ever bridge the gap and turn away the judgment of God. Only the intervention of God incarnate can save. Jesus is our only hope. We need Jesus because we have sinned. We have all wrecked this relationship between us and God, and we deserve judgment for it. We need Jesus. And the centurion recognizes this. He recognizes Jesus as his only hope for his servant to get well. He needed Jesus, just like we need Jesus to save us from this disease of sin. But something amazing here. Jesus shows this example of faith through a Gentile. Because up to this point, God's chosen people, the Jewish nation, a lot of them are under the impression that they are the only people who can have this relationship with God that can save. And yet Jesus shows here that it's not even about your lineage. It's not about what you know. It's not about what you do. It's about who you know. It shows right here that anyone can aspire to and have a faith that God is pleased with through Jesus. Anyone can be saved. The offer of salvation is not just valid for the Jewish nation, but for everybody. But notice what the faith of the centurion looks like. First, the centurion is humble. We have a Roman centurion who has gone out to battle, who has won, who commands soldiers, who is overseeing this whole town, who is a man of high position, of high honor, and from a human standpoint has every right to demand Jesus do what he says. And yet, this Roman centurion not only doesn't demand anything from Jesus, he doesn't even believe he's worthy to be around Jesus. He recognizes his place before God incarnate. Regardless of whether he knows that or not, he still recognizes Jesus as someone different and recognizes Jesus as someone above him. And he doesn't even believe he's worthy to be around Jesus. We have a humble centurion. We are to have a humble faith before a holy God. God who is the epitome of perfection, the epitome of good. And we who are sinful people who need God's intervention. We need to have a humble faith before a God who did not have to save us. We've talked about that before, and we need to get that idea through our heads. Jesus didn't have to come down. Jesus did not have to do anything. God did not have to make any way. God could have wiped us all out and would have been completely just for doing so. But we have a God who loves and cares about us enough to come down from heaven and die. Before that kind of a holy God, we need to have some humility because of who we are dealing with and because God is worthy of that kind of humble worship. Just like the centurion is humble before Jesus. The centurion with his faith did not presume that he had any right to demand anything from Jesus. He didn't go up and tell Jesus, you go do this. He pleaded, he asked. Sometimes in prayer we tend to come across as arrogant and presumptuous. And we demand our needs that we think we need from God. Thinking that, well, of course, I've got faith, so God is going to give me whatever I want. That's not how this works. We are not to have a presumptuous faith. This is God's will we are following. This is God's plan we are following. Having a faith that is not presumptuous means we accept whatever answer God gives to us. Jesus could have told that centurion, no. And I wager a guess that centurion, with the kind of character we see he has here, would have said, all right. We have no right to demand anything from Jesus. None. God knows best with his plan. Don't presume anything. Don't have a faith that is presumptuous. And the centurion trusted enough not to even question whether Jesus had the ability or the authority to heal. He just knew. He knew. And he didn't even question it. He had no doubt in his mind. He does not question Jesus at all. We must have a faith that not only is not presumptuous, but also a faith that doesn't question either, but follows. We're not called to question Jesus. We're called to follow Jesus. Sometimes that means Jesus leads us into places that might not be completely comfortable. But Jesus knows what he's doing. I've told you this a million times before. I've got that little note card from that Christian cartoonist on my wall. I've got to look at it on a daily basis, and it reminds me every single time. It's a little note card, and it says, "Trust me, I've got everything under control, signed Jesus." Our job is not to question why. Our job is to follow. The faith that is to be aspired to is one that humbly trusts Jesus without presumption or question, just like the centurion. Do you have a faith like the centurion did? One that humbly comes to Jesus and doesn't question, does not presume to demand anything, but just pleads, "Please, Jesus, you are my only hope." Let's pray. Father God, we thank you that you do offer us hope through your Son, Jesus. We pray that right now we can grow our faith to be like the one whom your Son pointed to. One that trusts in you no matter what happens. In your name, amen.